I'm talking about some work of mine which spans across, if you like, archaeology and biological anthropology. I'm very much an archaeologist, but I work with biological anthropologists. And the talk this afternoon is the same. But in the Q&A session in the middle, there are a couple of archaeology students, Joe, who's a first year, and Azra, who's a second year. And I know Azra, she took the Assyrian language in her first year. She's doing archaeological science and medieval archaeology in her second year. And I think Joe is doing one of the biology options. So you've got a chance in the Q&A to the students later to ask questions just right across that whole range of disciplines. Anyway, this is what I'm going to be talking about. And I thought we're going to do a double act. So we're looking at the theme of, okay, what can we learn from the living? What can we learn from the dead about the living? And so I'm going to talk about Neanderthals. And Craig Sesford is going to talk this afternoon about the bodies under my own college, the medieval bodies. So Neanderthals, who were they, where were they, when were they? Well, they're called Neanderthals because a skull was found in 1856 in the Neander Valley, that's the Neanderthal. And you can see from the map that we now know that Neanderthals lived across an enormous area of Eurasia, from Spain and Portugal and Britain all the way across to the Urals in Russia, and from the north, Britain, Germany, down to the Middle East. And that's the site I'm going to be talking about. They've had I should have said also, I missed on that previous picture, it also showed when they're around. I mean, they're around from about 400,000 years ago to about 40, over an enormous area, over a huge amount of time. And of course, they're not there now. For 100 years, ever since that discovery, they've had a really bad press. And you know how people use the adjective Neanderthal when they use it about somebody. They're not talking about it. It's not implying that they're graceful, poetic, sensitive, and so on. It's the archetypal caveman image that they've had a really bad press for a long time. Physically, in fact, they weren't so different from modern humans. I should say modern humans is the term that archaeologists use for Homo sapiens, for our species. So we talk about archaic humans and modern humans. And if you remember crowds before COVID, if you've been in a large group of people, if there'd been Neanderthals amongst them and we're all dressed in the same sort of way and so on, you wouldn't really dramatically different physically. But the big debate is, what were they like behaviorally? And the site that's been incredibly important for helping us reimagine Neanderthals from that caveman image has been this cave, Shanidar Cave in Iraqi Kurdistan. It's a wonderful south-facing cave in fabulous country. And it's from iconic excavations by a wonderful man called Ralph Solecki, who died in his hundreds a couple of years ago. In the 1950s, he conducted 5 seasons of excavations. He dug a 14, 15 meter deep trench in the cave up in the mountains of Iraq. He had to, employ a load of local workmen and get them trained. He had incredibly difficulties getting access to the sort of scientific techniques that he wanted to use. They had bus-sized boulders they had to get rid of with dynamite. I mean, it was an amazing excavation project. And he wrote a number of papers. He wrote this fabulous book called Shanidar, the First Flower People, about the project. And this is a schematic picture through that deep trench. And as you can see there in red, he found what were Middle Paleolithic stone tools, which are the kind that in Europe are associated with Neanderthals. And indeed, he found Neanderthal bodies. So the lower part of the cave, he's got Neanderthals in it with Neanderthal material culture. The upper part of the cave, he had the material culture, which we call Upper Paleolithic, which we associate with modern humans, but he didn't find any modern human bones. So it's a supposition that he's got a sequence from Neanderthals to modern humans, but with a 10,000-year gap, he thought, between them. The other aspect you notice, at that time, radiocarbon dating was the main method for dating these sorts of sites. And he got and the limit was about 40,000 years ago. So that took him down to this sort of boundary between Neanderthals and modern humans. But the lower part of the cave, he just couldn't date at all. They hadn't got the means at the time. He had to operate with sort of guesswork about sediments. So the sort of discoveries from the Neanderthals, the first one found was Shanidar number 1, so it's known as Shanidar 1. You can see a picture there of how it was when it was found. It had massive injuries in life. It had got one arm more or less missing. It had had a fantastic injury to its head, with been really smacked at some point with some, and whether an accident or whatever. But he must have been, he was a male, adult male. He must have been virtually blind, virtually deaf, and crippled. And yet he was buried at some considerable time later. Now these are hunter-gathering people. They live in bands of 40, 50 people, perhaps. They're mobile, moving around. They were hunting animals in Shanidar, like wild goats, which are still around today. He couldn't possibly have been hunting himself, so he must have been looked after by the community. And that was one of the first aspects of Shanidar. It's really probably the earliest example in the archaeological record of humans showing compassion. And then there's the other side of our humanity, our propensity to be horrible to each other. Shanidar number 3, when they looked in detail at the bones, you can see that there's a rib which had got an injury to it, which under the microscope they could see had been caused by some kind of spear point, some kind of projectile. And now at the time, it was thought that projectiles, meaning sort of not quite arrows, but the sort of spears thrown with spear throwers and so on, they were thought to be a technology that wasn't Neanderthal, but was modern human. So there are all sorts of scenarios people thought of some modern human chasing a Neanderthal. Who did it? Of course, it could have been an accident, but it does look like violence. The most famous burial of all was Shanidar number 4, because sediments were taken from around the soil and sent off for specialist analysis by a French palynologist, Arlette Loire-Gourand. And she found clumps of pollen. And of course, you've got flower pollen just blowing around in the wind, but these were definite clumps. So she said it can't just be the flowers that grow outside the cave blowing in. She suggested that the Neanderthals had buried the body with flowers. So it's known as the flower burial. Now that's been hugely debated ever since. A few years after the study, somebody pointed out that there are animals at the cave, gerbils that take flowers down into the earth and so on. So Shanidar has been at the center of really debates ever since those discoveries about how similar or different Neanderthals were to us. And you can see now why Solecki called that book about Shanidar the first flower people. Of course, that was in the 70s, the great age of flower. Now, I was privileged to be invited to go back. The Kurdistan government wrote to me out of the blue, and I couldn't really believe my luck because it's a site that and we started the project in 2014, but we had to stop because of the ISIS attacks on the region. So we didn't really start digging in 2015. And we've basically been going there for a month, once or twice a year since then until COVID. And we're due to go back, COVID allowing, this summer. You see a picture there of what it was like pre-excavation. The big trench you'd got had been more or less filled in. So we've been working to reopen, digging out all the stuff that's filled the cave, filled the trench ever since. And the cave's been lived in. It has shepherds until it became a sort of tourist protected site. Shepherds would be living in there with their animals every winter. Now you can see on that plan, I said the deep sounding and the eastern extensions, what he called that part of the trench. And that's where he found most of the Neanderthals. You can see the black and white photograph, Shanidar 1, 3, 5, 4. They were the locations on that, around that extension to his deep cave, down in that deep sounding. So you can see our own picture, 2016, where we've emptied out the same part of the trench and exposed his trench walls, and then further down as well. And we've got down now below his lower Neanderthals, and we've got down to a layer that you see there marked in the plan. He thought was a layer of stalagmite, and we're down at probably well, we've dated it by the new methods. One of the methods called OSL dates sediments. We're down at about 80,000 years ago, and I suspect that the bottom of the cave and the bottom of the Neanderthal occupation is probably something like 120,000 years ago. And these are what we've been doing. We're exposing his trench walls. We're then using all manner of methods to date the sediments to get a chronology through, say, I suspect it is going to be 120,000 years long. We've also taken a lot of samples to try to understand what the climate was like and the environment, because one of the big debates is that Neanderthals disappeared because they couldn't adapt to dramatic climate change in the way that modern humans are able to. You then impregnate it with wax and it becomes rock hard. And then you can cut a thin slice through it, a microscopically thin glass slide through it, and look at the sediments in microscopic detail. Ancient DNA you probably know about, taken from bones, but actually also, and there's colleagues at Cambridge and Copenhagen are trying to see if they can get ancient DNA out of our finds. But also a new technique is getting ancient DNA out from sediment. So we've been sampling all the way down the sediment. So it's known as eDNA, environmental DNA. Because we haven't found modern human bones either, and we're great if we can find Neanderthal and or modern human DNA in the sediments. We've cut these what are called sample columns down the side of his walls to get detailed sediments. We've done bigger excavations, and everything that isn't put in a bag to come back to Cambridge or to go around to the world to the variety of labs that are working on this, everything else is brought down from the cave and washed. And then half the team sit there and screening, going through all of the washed residues, because the object is to try to collect everything that's 2 millimeters or bigger. So it's very, very slow, very minute work. Now, I never expected to find new skeletons. When I originally was invited and I wrote bids for grants to pay for the work, I said, well, the big question we want to look at is what caused the demise, climate, and therefore, so what we're hoping to do is to locate the positions where Solecki had found the Neanderthals and date the sediments by the new methods and get lots of information on the climate. So I wasn't really expecting to find bones, but after a couple of years, we did actually start to find fragmentary bones in the part of the excavation that's shown there. And where that white arrow is in the Solecki photograph, and my red arrow going down, is fragments of he knew he'd only got part of it. It was a fragmentary body found towards the end of his project, which he therefore was number 5. And we found bits of legs and the backbone, various bits of a body. And Emma Pomeroy, who's the biological anthropologist, who actually is a colleague at Cambridge. In fact, she did a degree at Cambridge originally in archaeology and biological anthropology. Emma's doing all the study of the bones, and she was able to show definitely that the bones that we've found at this point do definitely belong to this skeleton that Solecki found, Shanidar number 5. It's an adult male Now, Solecki thought that separately from like Shanidar 4, the flower burial, he thought that the other Neanderthals had mostly died by rockfall, just by natural rocks falling on them. And I think one thing we've shown is that wasn't the case. This was one he thought had been killed by rockfall. Well, definitely wasn't, but it was in some sort of gully. Cave sediments are really very active, they're very moving, and there's a lot of water in different seasons running through. And it was in a gully caused by water flow, but was placed there. And then further down, you see there, we've got the number 5 marked by the arrow. And then down in that deep sounding, we've also been doing excavations near where he found Shanidar 4, the flower burial. You can see the point, in fact, it's in that circle on the left is Emma Pomeroy. Now, Shanidar 4, when they found the body and exposed it, they made a kind of coffin of soil. They cut out round the soil that the body was in, the bones were in, and protected it all with wood and plaster and Paris, and got it out of the cave. And there you see the picture of it being brought out, because the idea was to try and take it down to Baghdad to do a more scientific excavation of the body. And they knew there were bits and pieces of, they could see underneath there were some leg bones as well, so they thought there might be more bodies. Anyway, this coffin was manhandled down from the mountains, and they got it at one point on the roof of a taxi, and it had a sort of horrific journey down to Baghdad. And when finally the biological anthropologist kind of opened the lid, he was confronted with a kind of soup of bones. It was no longer the Shanidar 4 skeleton nicely arranged on the top. So he gradually had to work out, and subsequent people who studied the remains in Baghdad, particularly a specialist called Eric Drinkhouse, trying to work out what bones were in this cluster. And they eventually worked out there were probably 4. So Shanidar 4, which you see in this little diagram, is one on the left. And these are showing the bits of the bones that were there. Shanidar 4 is the flower burial. And then the other bones that didn't fit, they made Shanidar 6, and other bones that still didn't fit, they made 8. And they also found an infant, tiny space. Now, we've been able to excavate right by where that block was taken. If you see on the left-hand picture, that's actually Ralph Solecki, bottom left. And you can see where his hand is, there's a sharp edge. That's the edge of that block of sediment that he took out. And the guy behind, I think that's the biological anthropologist, he's got his hand on a triangular rock. And you can see on the right, the same triangular rock. And we, having cleaned the section, we could see the pieces of human bone in the cleaned section. That hole that you can see, that's a hole that from one of the dating methods, OSL dating, where you have to get a column of sediment out from underneath, out from inside the sediment. Anyway, Emma Pomeroy did the excavations, and this is in a tiny space and absolutely horrific conditions of humidity and so on. And also the condition of the bone. In fact, one of the people said it reminded them of when you take a digestive biscuit and dunk it in tea, and it was that sort of consistency. So she's had to consolidate the bones very slowly. But you can see here what we found in this tiny space, only what, half a meter from where the Shanidar 4 flower burial was. First of all, we had this crushed skull, top left, looking like a pancake. And then there were parts of the arms, which is the big picture on the right. And then the last season, 2019, we were there. We've got the backbone as well. And it appears to be lying, it says this upper body lying down, probably with its head on this kind of pillow of a stone. And it's the first articulated Neanderthal found anywhere for something like 30, 40 years. So Emma's been trying to work on what's the relationship between what in the Shanidar 4 block of sediment. And what she's shown here, what she's done here is put the relationship of our finds to theirs. And it seems pretty clear. We've got the left arm, there's the right arm. We've got the upper body, Shanidar 6 legs and so on. So it looks like, although we called it Shanidar Z because we weren't sure what it is, it looks like the lower body was in the group of these bones. But having said that, we've also got bones that are in the Shanidar, well, what they interpreted as Shanidar 6 as well. Now you can't have, two left legs or whatever. So it's pretty clear that this this division of the skeletons isn't quite right. It's clearly more complicated than that. And what's surprising too, well, is I think we have shown, I mean, a lot of the science is going on still, but I think it's difficult to argue that this is not a deliberate burial, that this is not Neanderthals thinking about death and its aftermath and putting the body carefully somewhere. Because some people have said Neanderthals didn't bury their dead, or some people said, well, they might have just sort of put them in holes and covered them up to keep predators away, keep the smell and so on. So, but this does look like something that you and I would have recognized if we'd come to this group of some kind of funerary ritual. So what we've got, it is in a water channel like that Shanidar 5, but what the detailed sediment studies have shown is there's earth, non-fluvial sediments within and under the body. And what one of these micromorphology slides has shown is there is a definite sort of cut, packed edge. So it looks like they've gone to a gully, they've deliberately widened it, and then there's been an act of putting the body in with earth below and within it, probably on top of it too. There's some kind of putting in and covering up, and there are pollen grains in that micromorphology. So there is vegetation with the body. And so it's difficult to argue that this is simply just put in and a few bits of vegetation thrown on to cover up. It does look like some sort of ritual activity. Well, I should have said, and they said there, we've got Neanderthals. Were they, which we're trying to tackle now, did people come at times when they weren't living there and to bury the dead? What's the time gaps between these different bodies? And was it within living memory, or were these dead bodies more or less around where people were living amongst their campsites? And that's there are indicators of grave markers. This particular stone that we talked about, there are stones that aren't natural, like all the rubble and the stones above. So it looks like they're placed to mark. So if you like, Neanderthals knew when they were coming back to the cave where these little cluster of bodies was. And also, we're finding bits of other bodies. You can see here, finger bone, wrist bone, teeth. And there are new individuals as well underneath our body. So it does look like, I mean, you can only use the word cemetery in with inverted commas, but it's absolutely unique in Neanderthal studies, this tight little cluster carefully placed. So it does suggest that Solecki was right. And there's further evidence for just the complexity of what's going on in Neanderthals' heads. One of the markers of what's called modern human behavior found in a cave in South Africa and another one in Morocco, sorry, have been pierced shells that looked like they could have been sewn onto clothing, they could have been necklaces. And there's something going on there in terms of people showing their identity, marking identity somehow. And so they've been associated with modern humans. Little pierced shells. You see from that picture, the Shanidar 5 body was in that marked gully. There are beads above, but there are beads below. So it looks like our Neanderthals too may have been making beads as well. And this is fitting into a growing body of evidence for the complexity of what's going on in Neanderthals' heads for some kind of symbolic reasoning. There's ochre, there's paints on shells from sites. There's extraordinary, there are dates now for some artistic marks, ochre marks in caves in Spain, which are 10 or 20. There's a site where it looks like that they're using feathers as headdresses. Eagle talons have been found at another site. We've got the Shanidar 4 flower burial there. And there's cannibalism evidence, for example, from a cave in Belgium. And again, what might that mean? I mean, there's cannibalism, you know, it's clearly all sorts of socially complex contexts in present day or recent societies. Again, what's going on there too. So it is a study of, we're getting completely different changing views about Neanderthals. Designer, it was an exhibition on Neanderthals a couple of years ago. And it raises all sorts of ideas about just how complicated they were. They weren't like us, but they absolutely weren't cave people. One of the biggest questions is did they have language? Well, they had the gene that that we have that codes for complex language, and they had the sort of physical structure in their mouths, their throats, and so on. So that's one of the. But it's just incredibly difficult to imagine some of the things I've been talking about without some sort of means of communicating in quite complicated ways between each other. Ancient DNA also is showing interbreeding. We've all meant to have, or most populations across Eurasia have got a few percent of Neanderthal DNA. We all have in us. And the most likely time and the most likely place, well, the most likely place is actually in Southwest Asia, in that Shanidar sort of area, because we know that modern humans were out of Africa in that area, and Neanderthals were down there at around roughly the same time. So that's one of the more likely times and places is when there was interbreeding between these two. So they are sort of sister species. I mean, the definition of a species is you can't breed together. Well, clearly they were. So, you know, they are our closest evolutionary cousins. They seem to have diverged 500,000 years ago. Neanderthals are a Eurasian species. They stayed in Eurasia. So they did move down from the north into the Shanidar area at one point, but they're there for this enormously long time, and they go extinct around 40,000 years ago. Our own species, modern humans, we evolve in Africa. We start coming out of Africa probably 100,000 years ago. There are probably several episodes, several dispersals. By 40,000 years ago, our species is over all of Europe, all over Eurasia, right down through Southeast Asia into Australia. So we changed from an African species, from a global species. We changed from an African species to a global species. And by 40,000, we're all over Eurasia and Neanderthals have gone. Which therefore brings us, of course, to the big question is why? What happened to Neanderthals? Which, of course, is a huge study separate from this. So many thanks. And just to finish, archaeology is a team subject. It's a subject that spans the arts and the sciences. I came to Cambridge originally to do classics and changed to archaeology, changed to prehistoric archaeology. I've worked in later periods too. But right from the beginning, it hit me more than anything else. It's a team subject, it's a collaborative subject. It involves working in the field in sometimes difficult conditions, but it also involves practical things, but engaging in big questions about who we are and where we come from. So I hope it gives that some flavor of why it transformed my life. And I hope you're engaged too, to think about it at university as well.